What's up, everyone? Welcome to today's video. Welcome to the Video Game Fight School channel. Thank you very much for tuning in. So God of War Ragnarok has finally received its release date, and according to some of my hypotheses that I put out in the past, I said to myself that I think Hogwarts Legacy was more than likely going to have its release date be released somewhere after Ragnarok got its, because as much as many know, both games are quite popular. Yes, granted, there's a huge Harry Potter fan base, but it still doesn't necessarily mean that God of War doesn't have its own strong fan base, because it's been coming for a very long time. It's kind of an older franchise, so it really does have a wide array of fans, especially the ones who were newly introduced to it in the 2018 release. But nonetheless, I think now Hogwarts Legacy might be getting closer to getting its own official release date, because this now puts things in a lot of perspective. Those of us here in the community that have been looking forward to it, we already know that it was announced that the game was on track for this year. So I'm going to go ahead and put my hypothetical guess for the date that we're probably going to be seeing for this particular game. Now, keep in mind, God of War Ragnarok already has a November 9th release date. In my opinion, I felt this was actually pretty cool. They were able to basically just go ahead and pick the beginning of November. It seems to somehow be able to have its spacing from some of the October games, including Gotham Knights, which is also a significant launch as well. Not necessarily the biggest compared to, say, Gotham Knights. Now, if it was a Batman game, then it definitely would have been a much more bigger launch, but it is still something that as developers, they had to take into consideration. So if you follow that kind of a calendar, we'll look at Gotham Knights at October 25th, and then look at, say, 2 weeks later, you have God of War about, November 9th. I think we're going to be seeing Hogwarts Legacy somewhere around, and this is just me spitting a hypothesis, somewhere around the 30th of November, or at least the 7th of December. So that week of the 30th, so maybe you call it week of the 28th of November, or week of the 5th of December. Why I gave a bigger space compared to, say, the 2 weeks in between Gotham Knights and, say, God of War is because Hogwarts Legacy, if I was going to be setting a date, I would recognize that I want the hype to somewhat cool off with November releases, especially with God of War. Usually hype kind of mellows down around the 2 week mark. And this is why I said at the earliest, we'll probably be hearing the 28th, the week of the 28th. So anywhere from the 28th of November all the way to the 3rd. I mean, they don't release games on Saturdays, but let's just say the 2nd, or we're going to probably use that week of the 5th, because at that point, God of War would have probably calmed down. People would have gotten their hands on it. People would have beaten it, done reviews, talked about it. It will be written about and all of the above. And if you're a developer or you're someone in the marketing, bam, just like that, you can come in and say, yes, here's Hogwarts Legacy, another RPG for you RPG hungry fans. And that's one way to do it. Now, on Twitter, fellow content creator Podcast Now posted and said, when do you think that, Hogwarts Legacy is going to be getting its reveal or release date? I was being silly and I said, hot take, 2023. Now, I know that's something that here in the community we've discussed before. But again, folks, it's not out of the question. If you space your game outright, you probably will be able to hit that goals that you need to be able to get the most sales impact. One thing is, if a game is very popular, just because that's the notion, you also want to look around other possible video games as well. Keep in mind that the God of War date has carefully considered other releases that are somewhat close in identity as well. And I think it is this same strategy that Hogwarts Legacy is possibly going to go with. In fact, I'll be shocked if the game is revealed even earlier. Now, here's another possibility, and this is one that we probably have not necessarily considered, and this is based on, say, when pre-orders are likely to go out for a lot of video games. We have a huge opening in September and also a decent opening in October. Now, this is quite weird because these are both Warner Brothers games, and for Warner Brothers, it'd be somewhat unlikely for them to want to release two of their major games for the year on top of one another. But again, at the same time, that's something that you have to go back and say, okay, what is the potential impact of each game? And October might even be a possibility to also space things out. Say, maybe Hogwarts Legacy gets an early October release far away from Gotham Knights. After all of its hype, after all of the noise around it, then Gotham Knights can get its shine. but I really don't see that as a likelihood. So it's as unlikely as a 2023 release. So if you were to categorize them, what is the most unlikely scenario for Hogwarts Legacy being released at a given date that's closer or farther? I would argue that you would have to shelve those into the least likely category. So an October release and a 2023 release are the least likely possibilities. Not saying that they're impossible, it's just the least likely situation that we're going to see. The most likely situation that's going to honor the 2022 window is somewhere around the end of November or the beginning of December. Also keep in mind, December did not necessarily used to be a big release window for some of the bigger games in terms of, say, RPG or adventure games. It wasn't until somewhere around 2020 that we started to see that December release date pack on top of one another. In fact, if you go back and look at December 2020, you'll remember that we got Immortals Fenyx Rising, which was Ubisoft's action adventure game that kind of mimicked Zelda. It was a decent game. And we also got Cyberpunk 2077. Now, let's not talk about the console version of that game, but it still felt like a good window for big AAA titles to still drop their games. And so December just seems like an opening that Hogwarts Legacy cannot afford to miss. Now, here's a big question. Based on a lot of the conversations that we've been having, the one thing that we're not necessarily quite aware of, because there's still no official release date, is the development progress of the game itself. One thing about a lot of these video games is they're constantly and continually trying to optimize things even as the release window draws near. One thing about video games is video games are based on engineering, and anybody who knows the popular saying, an engineer will optimize and optimize up to infinity if they could, they know that these games continue to receive fine-tuning here and there. If right now even there's still maybe one bug and they already have the full game in place, they probably have a build where they're just trying to tweak that particular bug or do all their bug fixes at least before the game launches. And this is something we have to take into consideration. One reason you see God of War being able to streamline its process is because it only has a very small burden to deal with, and that is just PlayStation consoles. They already released a full game on the PS4. All they have to do is basically optimize for the PS5 for better graphics and textures. Hogwarts Legacy, on the other hand, has to make sure that it has its game optimized for the multiple platforms that it's going to be available on. You also have to consider the Xbox One, the different versions of the Xbox One, the PlayStation 4, the PlayStation 4 Pro, PS5, Xbox Series X, Xbox Series S, and then finally PC, which I don't necessarily think that will be a really huge problem. It's Unreal Engine. Usually Unreal Engine 4 has a very good reputation of being able to run its games very well for the PC platform. Now, this is dependent on how the developers are able to build and optimize, but I don't necessarily think we have too much of a problem in that department. So for those of you who are keeping an eye out, these are some of my hypotheses and how I've come by them. I've just looked at different patterns for video game release, the way big AAA titles usually follow one another, the amount of space they try to give each other so that there's not too much of an impact on one game in a way that affects another game. I think we've seen that even though people liked Horizon Zero Dawn and people were looking forward to Horizon Forbidden West, the big mistake that they made was that they launched around the same time as Elden Ring. Even though people would probably argue as to which game they prefer, we cannot ignore the fact that Horizon as a franchise has suffered from being stacked close to big releases. In fact, if you go back and look at Horizon Zero Dawn, it launched in the same release window as Zelda. I mean, how can that game ever get a break or get its own spotlight without being judged in light of other games? So this is a very unique thing that development has to consider. And so with God of War, it's unique enough. It's a sequel. It already has a fan base. It already seems to have a huge number of sales. And so I think this is why the developers were very comfortable in choosing that beginning November date. Even if a Call of Duty game was on the side as well, which is interesting, they still went ahead and made that decision for their own game. So in the comment section, I would love to hear your thoughts regarding when you think this game, which is Hogwarts Legacy, is going to be coming out. Throw a guess out there. There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, if we're wrong, then we're wrong. That's all that happens. It's not like we're claiming that it's going to be a fact. We're just putting out hypothetical information that we think is more likely. Talk to you guys soon. Thanks for watching the video. Peace out.